I just want to say to the Cuban comrades, when Comrade Teresa Gutierrez and I went to the Marx Bicentennial Cuba a few weeks and years ago, we could see the difficulties of the Cuban people struggling to keep their economy going and keep their lives going. But we could also hear every place the enthusiasm for the revolution, which was pretty universal. So we just want to comment on that. I also see a lot of familiar faces here. I don't know the names, but I saw you all last week up in Boston in the struggle against Veolia and that great rally that took place outside the yard. But I would like to start very briefly by going over the present state of the capitalist crisis so that we know where we really are. 6 years after the crisis began and 4 years after the so-called capitalist recovery, our diagnosis of capitalism at a dead end has been completely confirmed. There are still close to 12 million officially unemployed, 8 million workers forced to work part-time, and millions who have dropped out of the workforce. Perhaps 25 to 30 million workers unemployed or underemployed in the U.S., especially among the youth, and especially among Black and Latin youth. And this is despite the Federal Reserve Board pumping $85 billion a month into the economy. The jobless recovery goes on. The bosses and the bankers more and more are resorting to speculative paper profits and looting public institutions, the way the bankers are looting Detroit. But speculation and looting don't create jobs, they destroy jobs. Food stamps are being slashed. Hunger is on the rise. The New York Times recently carried a picture of an African-American worker who was dependent on food stamps, and he had only $5 worth left of his stamps with 2 weeks to go in the month. This is what's going on out there. And these cutbacks are hitting over 4 million people, most of whom have jobs but still live in poverty. Unions are under attack, from the Boston bus drivers to the Bay Area rapid transit workers to the ATU in New York City, the bus drivers in New York City. The pro-big business Supreme Court is now hearing arguments about outlawing card check and employer neutrality agreements, for those who know what that is. The healthcare crisis of millions is being aggravated by the near collapse of the Affordable Care website. And the crisis is pushing all capitalist politics to the right. Racist violence and repression persists, as illustrated by the cold-blooded murder of Renisha McBride in Dearborn, Michigan, by a trigger-happy racist. Attacks on women's rights and LGBT people have escalated. Deportation of the undocumented have not slowed down, and the drive for the further militarization of the border goes on. Militarism and devastation of the environment continue unabated. In Europe, there is record unemployment, especially among the youth, and in Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America, and the Caribbean, unemployment and poverty rates are much higher than in the big capitalist countries. Indeed, capitalism is still at a dead end, and it may soon be time for the party to think about job marches and hunger marches to demand jobs and food for the masses. But I would like to touch on the historic question confronting the party, the radical movement, and on the union movement, namely organizing the working class for struggle against the bosses and ultimately against capitalism. And in that regard, I would like to spend some time discussing the low-wage workers movement. I will not examine it. I hope others will do that. I want to discuss what I believe is the symptomatic significance of this movement as a harbinger of future struggles that are to come. And I would like to put it in historical perspective. Karl Marx, in the Communist Manifesto, pointed out that the greatest accomplishments of the capitalist class were the development of gigantic productive forces and the creation of the working class. These two developments go hand in hand. What the capitalist class did was to concentrate the workers into great capitalist enterprises, thereby bringing them out of rural isolation and putting them together where they could organize against the very bosses who brought them there for the purposes of exploitation and the extraction of surplus value or unpaid labor. Over the history of capitalism, the character and the organization of the working class has changed as the development of the productive forces progressed. From the early periods of craft associations like tailors and shoemakers and weavers and wheelwrights, to the larger craft unions of the industrial era like pipe fitters and engineers and plumbers and so forth, to the semi-skilled industrial unions of the era of mass production and the assembly lines. And in the last 3 decades or more, the capitalist class has created the vast service proletariat in the US and other big capitalist countries. The agricultural population was a majority of the US population in the mid-19th century and was rapidly concentrated into cities, into factories, into mines, and mills in the era of industrialization. Out of this grew the class struggle, first to create the craft unions, and then in the 30s to create the industrial unions. Now, just as in previous eras, the capitalist class created the industrial working class. In the era of the globalization and the scientific technological revolution, big capital has created the low-wage service proletariat, which is now numerically preponderant. By pouring money and technology into commercial capital, transportation, finance, and trade, the bosses and the bankers have drawn millions of workers who were previously isolated in small businesses into low-wage, high-profit retail chains, healthcare services, and transportation systems. Tens of millions who were once in tiny shops, in local stationery stores, in lumber yards, hardware stores, local supermarkets, pharmacies, clothing stores, appliance stores, bank tellers, restaurants, diners, and so on, were invisible. They were without an identity. They were completely isolated from the broad working class and subject to the whims of small business owners. What capitalism has done in the last 30 years is to concentrate these occupations into vast chains like Walmart, McDonald's, Home Depot, Staples, CVS, Old Navy, Bed Bath & Beyond, Target, P.C. Richards, Starbucks, and so on. Many of them have been placed side by side in great shopping malls, in airports, in train stations, in transportation hubs. The workers who work for these chains have a common employer, a common identity, and a common knowledge of each other's misery and exploitation. A McDonald's worker in the Bronx can identify and talk to a McDonald's worker in East Los Angeles. In a word, the high-tech globalized phase of capitalism has brought these workers out of obscurity and into the network of socialized labor. That situation cries out for organization. There is a myth that has been circulating for years but which is beginning to be eroded by the low-wage workers' actions, that the workers in these chains cannot be organized. They are too spread out. There's too much turnover. The owners have deep pockets and can crush any attempt to organize, and so forth. Fortunately, the new radical movement, both inside and outside the labor movement, including but not limited to Occupy Wall Street veterans, have begun to look back in labor history to find precedents that will help and guide them in their approach to the working class. One example, which I wrote about 5 years ago in Low-Wage Capitalism, is the example of the little-known but great Woolworth sit-down strike of 1937, which led to the organizing of this chain and many other things. But I will read from a paper that is circulating, put out by the forces from Occupy Wall Street, because it is instructive to listen to their formulations. Quote, in 1937, Woolworths had an empire of 2,000 stores in the USA and Canada, plus more in Cuba, the UK, and Germany. It was the Walmart of its day. It had ruthlessly put small mom-and-pop stores out of business. Founder Frank Woolworth was an expert at finding cheap sweatshop and child labor in Europe. Quote, at precisely 11 a.m., February 27, 1937, a union organizer blew a loud whistle in Woolworths in Detroit and began yelling, strike, strike. 150 women workers stopped, folded their arms, sat down, and the strike began. In Low-Wage Capitalism, you can read how the strike spread throughout the Woolworth chain, then to other department stores, and spread to the East Coast and throughout the Midwest, and how the whole industry was organized. But I want to further continue a quote from the OWS paper. Quote, generations of corporate propaganda have imbued us with the idea that the workplace is strictly private property, a holy ground upon which we tread only at the sufferance of its owners. Freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and the right to petition grievances melt away within its sacred environs. The document concludes that to organize workers will mean, quote, challenging what Wall Street considers the private spaces of capitalism, the very lion's den of global corporations. This will be the Occupy movement's greatest challenge. I want to point out two things about this piece that are significant. I think the example of the Woolworth strike shows convincingly that low-wage retail workers can be organized. And it shows that the strikes today, the protests at the low-wage workers movement is engaging in, is a harbinger of bigger struggles to come. To be sure, the industrial proletariat is also becoming more and more low-wage. $15 an hour, that's only a survival wage. That's a survival wage. When I was in Boston, I was talking to a Latina bus driver from New York, and her pay was put down from $16 an hour to $15 an hour. And she was telling us how she can't even take the family out on Saturday night. They got to go to their mother-in-law's because they can't afford to go out. And that's on $15 an hour. And half the working class lives like that. That's a digression. It's not down here. But the low-wage service workers are the predominant section of the U.S. working class right now. Woolworths was spread out across the country. The owners were among the richest corporate families in the world. The major difference between then and now is that the workers were on fire in that period, on the offensive, and that the labor movement was supportive of the strike and the organizing drive. There are no structural barriers today to organizing the low-wage workers. The real barrier is the fear among the workers in the midst of this horrible economic crisis. But that may be diminishing. The other obstacle is the timidity of the labor leadership in the face of this historic challenge. And the second thing to point out is the evolution of some of the survivors of Occupy Wall Street and other radicals away from the general focus on broad income inequality to focus on the plight of low-wage workers and of the anti-capitalist move that has grown. To be sure, they are far away from Marxism as we understand it. But a revolutionary party can ignore this at its peril, especially the anti-capitalist movement. The activists are influencing the workers in a left direction, and both the workers and the movement will influence the labor movement. The urge of the workers to resist their terrible super-exploitation will drive this process forward and eventually lead to some form of break, as it did in the 1930s when the workers forced the labor leadership to help them organize. If we were strong enough, it would be interesting to hand out thousands of applications or petitions to the workers demanding that the unions come in and organize them. This is what happened in the 30s. The workers forced the labor leadership to organize them by submitting applications to join the union. I want to end on a theoretical note. The development of the productive forces, the enormous, gigantic creation of automated processes, has led to the creation of the service workers and the service proletariat, and the decimation of industrial workers, and the rise of the giant chains and big box stores. This is what has brought capitalism to a dead end. The increase in the productivity of labor due to automation, especially robots and software, as well as computerized inventory systems, the management of global production chains, and so on, is the very same force that constitutes the material and organizational foundation for a socialist society. Under capitalism, automation creates misery, speed up, and unemployment. Under socialism, automation will lift the burden of labor and create abundance. Wealth will be measured by the amount of leisure time workers have for their own personal development as human beings. Capitalism has created the material foundation. What remains is for us to take that foundation away from the capitalist class by the revolutionary destruction of the profit system and the creation of a new social system upon the already existing foundation created by the bourgeoisie themselves. It's there, but we need to make it free of exploitation, directed towards the fulfillment of human needs, namely socialism. In this struggle, there will be many forms of workers' organizations. There can be people's assemblies, workers' assemblies, Black Workers for Justice in the South, the Million Worker March. The working class will be creative in developing its own organization. But in that struggle, unions must play a fundamental role in bringing the workers together, uniting them so that they can at least fight the boss on the job. No more working at will. We have to put an end to that. And we have in this house a shining example of that. Now I want to just remember what Che Guevara said about Vietnam. He said the struggle against imperialism takes 1, 2, 3, many Vietnam. I want to say, 1, 2, 3, many, 87-51. And that's how we'll win. Down with capitalism, fight for socialism, build a multinational proletarian party for victory.